Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path, and I'm your host, Mike Allen. When we think of the Alamo, of course, we go back to San Antonio, Texas, where that famous battle took place at the Alamo Mission. You remember 2,000 Mexican soldiers were up against just 200 Americans. Well, the Americans held out for 13 days before every last one of them was killed. That was 1836. Well, today we have a very similar story that took place 50 years before that during the Revolutionary War here in Connecticut, the Battle of Groton Heights near the Thames River in New London Harbor. Our guest today is Hallie Keeler. She is president of the Friends of Fort Griswold Battlefield State Park Foundation. And just wait until you hear her rendition of what happened at that battle. She speaks for all in the Groton and New London area in calling it a massacre. This week's trivia question: this Connecticut tragedy brought the term lift slab construction into our collective vocabulary. What was that tragedy? We'll stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you'll know the topic for next week's show. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is brought to you by our sponsor, Yale New Haven Health. When people need the best quality health care, there's a reason they turn to Yale New Haven Health. In 1826, Yale New Haven Hospital became Connecticut's very first hospital. They were the first hospital in the U.S. to use chemotherapy. Yale New Haven was the first to introduce insulin pumps for diabetic patients, and they introduced the world's first intensive care unit for newborns. For more information about Yale New Haven Health, visit ynhhs.org. That's ynhhs.org. In case you forgot the story of the Alamo in Texas, it was back in 1836. Texas was actually part of Mexico, but there was a revolution underway in Texas, and the residents wanted to break off from Mexico. Well, this brought Mexican military General Santa Anna to Texas, and he had somewhere between 2,000 and 6,000 troops. The estimates kind of vary. The Alamo Mission building was relatively small, but it was very defensible. Unfortunately for the Americans, though, they only had about 200 fighters to defend it. One of them was famed frontiersman Davy Crockett from Tennessee. Another was Gordon Jennings. He was the only Connecticut resident who died there, because by the time the 13-day siege had ended, all of the Americans inside that fort were killed. But their heroic efforts to defend the Alamo Mission resulted in a battle cry of sorts that has stood the test of time during particularly impossible fights. Remember the Alamo. Well, in Connecticut, 50 years before that, there was a battle that was eerily similar to the Alamo, and it played out in Groton, and some call it Connecticut's Alamo. The Revolutionary War was finally nearing an end after 7 very long years. General George Washington and French General Rochambeau were about to win the decisive battle against the British in Yorktown, Virginia. Now, Washington had just outsmarted British Commander Henry Clinton in New York City. See, Clinton was expecting Washington and Rochambeau to attack him in New York City. Instead, they bypassed New York and headed south to Yorktown. You see, Clinton thought that if he sent a force to New London, he could perhaps convince Washington not to continue down to Virginia and instead come back and fight in New York. Washington didn't take the bait, and it would turn out that the month of September 1781 would see 2 rather notable military engagements. Early in the month, September 6th, Benedict Arnold would lead a British invasion of New London and Groton, and just 3 weeks later, Washington and Rochambeau would have their decisive final victory in Yorktown. Now, Benedict Arnold had only recently defected from the Patriot side to join the British. His first assignment had been a success. He captured Richmond, Virginia. This was his second assignment, attack New London and Groton, and that was less than 10 miles geographically from where he was born in Norwich, Connecticut. New London Harbor had 2 forts, Fort Trumbull in New London on the western shore, and Fort Griswold in Groton up a steep hill on the eastern side. And both were under the command of one person, Groton native William Ledyard. He was a colonel in the Continental Army. Now, he didn't have much in the way of trained soldiers or military supplies. The soldiers were basically just farmers. But what he lacked in those areas were more than made up for in terms of the pure grit and determination of those farmers. Ledyard had, by the way, several children, including a baby who had just been born shortly before the Battle of Groton Heights. Well, here to tell us this gripping story of the battle is Hallie Keeler, president of the Friends of Fort Griswold Battlefield State Park Foundation. Hallie, the Battle of Groton Heights is one of those battles in the Revolutionary War that if you live in and around the Groton area, you know very well. And if you study the Revolutionary War, you've certainly heard of it. We, I think, don't give it enough due for what it really was, which was, in my mind, Connecticut's Alamo, when you look at how many soldiers the British had versus the very few that the Patriots had and how valiantly they fought.
The British landed 800 men on the Groton side of Thames River, which is about a mile and a half from Fort Griswold. And then there were 800 on the New London side. So we had 1,600 soldiers. They were commanded by Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold is a persona non grata in this area. In fact, there are some historic groups that have ceremonies dishonoring him throughout the year, such as the burning of his leg in effigy, because he was wounded in New York in the leg.
So when you think of Benedict Arnold being originally from Norwich and now attacking in New London Harbor, tell us how you feel about that.
Of course, we think he was a traitor, but you have to understand that his personality was such that he wasn't getting the attention from the Americans that he felt he deserved. He did do some very courageous things during the various battles, and he felt that he wasn't getting the credit that he deserved. He wanted to be given greater honor, given greater commissions. One of the reasons we believe that he was so easily turned, his ego was being stroked by the British. You're not going to show me my due, so I'll do this, and I'll show you what kind of power I have.
Let's talk a little bit about New London Harbor and set this up for the audience and so they can follow along. If you're coming in from Long Island Sound and heading north up the Thames River, New London's on your left and Groton's on your right. They had two forts, one on either side. Tell me about those.
Fort Trumbull was little more than a fortification. If you see it today, it's a beautiful structure, which was used in later wars. But at the time, there was not much there. Fort Griswold, across the river, on the other hand, was a very advantageous location. It was on top of a hill. You can see all the way down the river. You could see the ships coming in. It was a good place to have a fort because you could see everything. The problem, which turned out, unfortunately, not to be as much of a problem as they had hoped, was that being on the top of the hill, there were brambles and swamps and tangled woods getting there. It's not like there was a clear path like there is today. It was all, as I said, swamps and brambles and woods, and it was very difficult for the British to get up there, or one had hoped so. They did manage to get foothold and climb the ramparts for the battle.
Benedict Arnold pulled a bit of a fast one, I think. So the Fort Griswold people, seeing that there are a bunch of British ships in the harbor, set off 2 cannon blasts. Would you explain what that was and what Benedict Arnold did in response?
Yeah, the cannon blasts signaled to anybody who heard them that we need reinforcements. Get yourself here. There were about 165 militia and local volunteers. These are not trained soldiers. He was expecting reinforcements. So Colonel Ledyard chose to defend the post because he figured the reinforcements were coming. The 2 cannon shots was his way of letting his people know that you got to get yourselves down there to the fort. Benedict Arnold knew that a 3rd cannon shot meant, oh, no, the ships are probably just privateers, the pirates of the time, so you needn't come. So Benedict Arnold had a 3rd cannon shot fired, so the volunteers didn't come. And there were only 165, 88 of them were killed, and it was a bloodbath. It was a massacre.
So as you say, there were 1,600 British soldiers up against 165 Patriots overall. Fort Trumbull, which was on the New London side, really just had a handful of people, and Colonel Ledyard, in fact, said, get across the river to Fort Griswold because that's what we're going to hold. So, meantime, Benedict Arnold and his other big commander that day, Edmund Eyre, they split the troops, 800 and 800, And Arnold took 800 into New London while Eyre went to Groton with his 800. When Benedict Arnold, let's just spend a quick second on this. So Arnold goes into New London. There's absolutely no resistance because all the soldiers are over on the Groton side in Fort Griswold. And he comes in and starts setting fire. And what happened to the town of New London in that siege?
It was burned to the ground. The people were fleeing up towards the Norwich way, going north, but they basically burned every building, home, shop that was along the waterfront.
Yeah, I read somewhere there were 143 structures burned in that event, which was just amazing. Now, Arnold, meanwhile, had told Eyre, you go over and take Fort Griswold. Could you pick up the story from there?
Yes, so he has a note to go to Eyre that said, oh, don't attack. There's not enough defense. The fort isn't strong enough, and that would be a fool's errand. There just aren't enough people to defend it, so don't do it. But of course, the messenger was either waylaid or killed. Either way, Eyre never got the message.
Well, meanwhile, let's talk about what Eyre was doing, which was he, in the traditional method, said you should surrender. And again, could you pick up that part of the story?
Eyre sent forward a flag demanding surrender at that point, but Ledyard refused. Talk about egos. I mean, they all really felt that they could do this. He asked again and again, and Eyre threatened that if he were forced to storm the fort, no quarter would be given to its defenders. Colonel Ledyard is alleged to have said, we will not give up the fort, let the consequences be what they may. The British forces spread their ranks. They advanced on the fort. They were met with an artillery barrage, which killed and wounded many, but they were seasoned troops. These guys knew what they were doing as opposed to the Patriots, and they continued the charge.
First, they're repelled as they come up as a single column, and they end up breaking off in two. So there's Eyre's group and Montgomery's group goes around the other side of the fort, and they attack from different ends. So Eyre is wounded. Ledyard was in the process of surrendering the fort, correct?
Yep, he was. Colonel Ledyard saw that the British had managed to reach the gate and opened it. The enemy was able to get through. So he ordered his men to stop fighting, even though that didn't actually happen. There was some question that they had, in fact, raised the white flag at some point, and it was shot down, which gave the British permission, so to speak, to go ahead and continue the charge. The American version holds that after Colonel Ledyard gave up his sword, what happened was one of the British officers had said, who commands this fort? And Colonel Ledyard allegedly said, I did, sir, but now you do. And he handed his sword, hilt first, to the British soldier, who then ran him through. And then the American wounded were massacred. The British version makes no mention of the massacre or the manner of Ledyard's death. Stephen Hempstead's journal, he gives an eyewitness account, and there are others, but there are people even today, and there are books that have been written that dispute the common version of how he was killed.
Montgomery is also going to be not only wounded, but killed in this. Tell me about Montgomery and his forces coming over the ramparts.
As you had mentioned, they came in two columns around the fort. Montgomery came to the side that actually they felt could not be scaled because it was steep, it was wooded, it was brambles, but they did it anyway. They got footholds in the stones, and they came up over the ridge. At that point, Colonel Ledyard had already been killed. And in revenge for having his very good friend, Colonel Ledyard, killed, Jordan Freeman, his manservant, had a 10-foot pike, and he ran Montgomery through with the pike and killed him instantly.
That's such a dramatic thought of what had happened. Well, certainly if you go to Fort Griswold, you read the story, and it's the American version and sort of the accepted version that's there. And one of the things that Stephen Hempstead talked about as well, because he ended up being a prisoner, and that's why he was able to give an account, was how the prisoners were treated, and they were put on a wagon, because most of them were wounded, to take them down to the British fleet so they could take them back to notorious prisons in New York City. And what happened with that wagon on the way back to the fleet?
Either it broke free or the British let go. But this wagon, and remember, this is a hill. It went down the hill at great speed and hit a tree. I mean, these men were already wounded, so it further added to their injuries, and a lot of them were killed. And just anecdotally, there's a story that says that on a quiet night, you can still hear them screaming. However, after they hit the tree, they were brought over to Ensign Ebenezer Avery's house, which was just a few steps away. But those who were able to walk were put on the British ships as prisoners. Then, as the day went on, the British troops ended up plundering and burning some of the homes on Groton Bank on that side of the river. They were merciless.
And now, 3 weeks after this event would be the Battle of Yorktown, which Cornwallis would lose and Washington and Rochambeau would win, and that was widely considered the end of the Revolutionary War. So this was one of the last real atrocities of the Revolutionary War.
It absolutely was. And that point is not lost on the supporters of Fort Griswold. There's very little attention paid to it, of the historical record. This was a battle. This was a massacre. And there's very little record of it. We at the Friends of Fort Griswold have been working very hard to raise the visibility of the fort because this was a catastrophic event and it really can't be lost to history.
So tell me about the Friends of Fort Griswold, what it is you do, and what people who come to the fort can expect to experience.
Our mission is to support the fort in whatever way it needs. We have events that we hold at the fort. We hold a commemoration of the battle on the Sunday of Labor Day weekend every year. The Sunday's closest to September 6th, which was the date of the battle, 1781. We put luminaria out on the battlefield, and we have a reading of the names. We like to have descendants, if possible, read the names of their ancestors. And as each name is read, the flame is put out. It's sobering. You know, we are there, standing there where they shed blood. We're standing smack in the fort where these men lost their lives, and we are honoring them.
Colonel Ledyard's sword, by the way, is housed at the Bill Memorial Library. That's located just half a block from the battlefield itself. Hallie Keeler worked there, by the way, for 35 years, retiring as its director. Now, she says Ledyard's coat, though, is in Hartford at the State Library. And occasionally there are calls to see if the sword and the hole in the coat line up, which could put an end to all the disputes about Ledyard's final moments. Unfortunately, she says, the deterioration of the coat's fibers have made such an experiment likely impossible to ever undertake. So she says the American version of the fight is the accepted version in that neck of the woods. That wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. The Battle of Groton Heights would be Benedict Arnold's last major military engagement. Now, while he was trying to impress both the British and the Patriots with his military prowess, a full 25% of the men under his command that day were killed or wounded in that fight, even though he outnumbered the Patriots 1,600 to 150. Said British Commander Henry Clinton in New York City afterward, quote, "I cannot afford many more victories like that." 3 weeks later, the Revolutionary War would be over. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Hallie Keeler, president of the Friends of the Fort Griswold Battlefield State Park Foundation. The answer to this week's trivia question, the question was, this Connecticut tragedy brought the term lift slab construction into our collective vocabulary. What was that tragedy? Well, it was the collapse of the L'Ambiance Plaza apartment building in Bridgeport during construction, in which 28 workers were buried under tons of concrete and killed. Next week on Amazing Tales, CT will revisit the tragedy with the Honorable Thomas Busey, the man who was mayor of Bridgeport during that tragedy. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and stay healthy.